Upon the 17th of November, in the cold and reluctant year of 1843, a letter was brought to my chambers in Lincoln's, in that bore the mournful seal of Hodge and Bramwell, solicitors. I had been named, by a great uncle whose name I scarcely knew, sole heir to Carfax House, a property of some antiquity in the salt-bleached lowlands of the East Coast, together with a private codicil exceeding strange, requiring me to reside upon the estate for 12 consecutive nights, and not one fewer, before I might call any single stone of it my own. The journey ended at dusk, in a country flat and grey as a drowned man's brow, where reedy meres lay still as pools of mercury, and the air was thick with the cold breath of the sea. Carfax House rose out of that low landscape, a tall, narrow, Jacobean pile of darkened brick, its slate roofs greened with lichen, its windows narrow and few. A single old woman in a black cap met me at the door, named herself Mrs. Keble, and bid me very gravely, on no account to enter the eastern study after the 8th stroke of the hour. Curiosity, that ancient enemy of prudence, undid me before the night was out. Some little before the 8th hour I took a candle and slipped, in stockinged feet, through the still passages to the eastern study. It was a narrow chamber, panelled in black walnut and choked with the dust of decades, and against the far wall stood a tall longcase clock of ebony, its silver dial worked with strange devices, 13 hours numbered upon the rim, the moon, a winged skull, and, in place of the usual figures, the names of men and women I did not know. The clock was running. The pendulum swung slow, weighty, deliberate, with a sound like a coin laid upon a coffin lid. I held my candle close to the case and made shift to examine it. The little crystal door was locked. The mechanism, so far as I could discern through the beveled glass of the dial, possessed no winding key, no chain, no falling weight, no spring, no mortal source of motion at all. It ran, I came to understand, on nothing, on no power any clockmaker upon this earth had ever named. At breakfast I asked Mrs. Keble of the clock. She set down the silver pot before answering, and her hand, I observed, was perfectly still. "It is the Vance clock, sir," she said. "It has run without ceasing for 130 years. It struck for old Sir Thomas the night the marsh took him. It struck for young Margaret on the morning of her wedding. It struck for your great-uncle Ezekiel 3 months past. It strikes once for each soul of this house, at the hour of its passing, and never twice, sir, for the same soul." That evening, when the house was still and a single candle burned upon my writing table, the 8th hour came. From the eastern study, where I sat in my great-uncle's chair, there issued a single deep note, long, full, resonant, prolonged beyond all reason. I counted, in spite of myself, 1, 2, 3. At the 11th stroke I caught my breath. At the 12th my candle guttered low. At the 13th, for the dial bears 13, there fell a great attentive silence, as though the house had asked some question and waited for my answer. By the 3rd night I had begun to perceive a change. The pendulum did not swing as it had upon the 1st. It travelled its slow arc with greater deliberation. It rested, at the extremes, for the smallest fraction of a second longer. I timed it against my pocket watch, and found the difference imperceptible to all but the most patient ear. Yet the difference was real, and it was widening, and I knew, with a certainty that had no need of proofs, that the great pendulum of Carfax House was slowing, slowing, slowing. In the lowest drawer of my great-uncle's desk, beneath a flattened lavender pressed in a black ribbon, I came upon his diary. He had filled it, as all that family had filled their diaries, with one subject only. "The clock slows," he had written in a hand that grew nightly wilder. "It slows in measure with my pulse. When the pendulum is still, I shall be still also. I have measured it. 11 nights remain, then 10, then 9, then 8. The final entry was a single word, written very small: "Listen." Upon the 5th night, I dragged the great pier-glass from the parlour and set it before the clock, hoping to surprise, in its silvered depth, some hidden mechanism that the front of the case denied me. What I beheld in that mirror was no clock at all. There was no pendulum within it, no dial, no ebony case. There was, where the clock should have stood, a tall, thin figure, robed and faceless, standing perfectly upright, holding in its long, pale hand a swinging silver chain and watching me as patiently as I watched it. On the seventh night, half mad with want of sleep and the ceaseless beating of that dreadful tick, I took the coal hammer from the parlor grate and fell upon the case in fury. The crystal would not crack, the walnut would not splinter. The pendulum proceeded, unmolested, through every blow, as though both hammer and arm passed through some thin black water that closed behind them. I sank at last upon the boards, and as I lay there I heard, beneath the ticking of the clock, the ticking of my own heart, and the two beat as one. I fled Carfax House before the dawn. I rode hard through the wet salt flats. I took the first packet from the harbor at Yarmouth. I crossed the German Sea by night. Yet in my cabin, by the swinging lantern in the close stink of tar and brine, I heard it still, the long, patient, deliberate tick, a beat behind my pulse, a pause longer than it ought to be, and then another. Distance, I understood, was no shelter. The clock I carried with me, the clock I had always, in some manner, carried with me. On the 11th night abroad, in a poor inn upon the coast of Holland, I laid my hand upon my breast and counted. My heart was slower than the tick I could not silence. Slower and slower yet, for the clock had begun, in its mild and dreadful patience, to lead. I understood at last what had been bequeathed to me, not a house, not a fortune, not a study, nor a chair, nor a name upon a dial, a measured term, and the pendulum was not the clock's. The pendulum was never the clock's. On the 12th night I returned to Carfax House. I walked through silent halls. I lit no candle. I needed none, for I knew the way as a blind man knows his own bed. I sat in my great uncle's chair before the ebony case. The pendulum hung now almost still, a long, slow, almost reluctant motion, as of a thing concluding. I waited, as Ezekiel had waited, as Sir Thomas had waited, as young Margaret had waited. The 13th hour began, very softly, to gather itself within the wood. The clock struck once, long and full, a coin laid gently upon a coffin lid. There was no second stroke. There has never been for any soul of that house. In the morning, Mrs. Kebble will find me, my great-uncle's diary open upon my lap, the last page filled in a hand that has at length ceased to shake. And in the eastern study, beneath the silver dial, where the names of men and women I did not know stand graven in their slow procession, my own name will have been added quietly, neatly, to the rest.